Oak Creek Memorial's emergency department hums with the particular frequency of controlled chaos, fluorescent lights buzzing their constant drone, monitors beeping in overlapping rhythms, the hiss of automatic doors opening and closing like the breathing of something alive. Natalie Hayes moves through this landscape with the kind of efficiency that comes from having organized far worse than civilian trauma. Her scrubs are simple, dark blue, and her dark hair is pulled back with military precision. Her left hand trembles almost imperceptibly as she reaches for a cardiac monitor, a tremor she's learned to absorb into her movements, to fold into the natural motion of reaching and working and moving forward. No one notices. Or if they do, they don't ask. She's been in San Diego for 14 months, and asking questions is the fastest way to stay invisible, which is exactly what she needs. Dr. Ashford notices her anyway. Not the tremor, he's too busy noticing the problem, which is Natalie herself. He's watching her from the nurse's station, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light like a crown, his expensive watch visible as he signs off on discharge paperwork. He's been department chief at Oak Creek Memorial for 9 years, and in 9 years, he's built something very specific, a hierarchy that flows from him downward, orders that descend and aren't questioned, a system where he is consulted, deferred to, and publicly recognized for every good outcome. He saw Natalie Hayes arrive on her first shift and understand immediately that she was the type who moved fast. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was why. A 62-year-old man comes in complaining of chest pressure and mild shortness of breath. Ashford glances at the triage note, orders an EKG and a basic metabolic panel, mentions something about anxiety, and returns to his email. The patient sits in bed 7, looking worried. Natalie reads the chart, sees the vital signs, blood pressure elevated at 148/92, heart rate slightly elevated, and something about the way the man is describing the pain makes her move. It's not a request in her mind. It's recognition. She has the patient consent to an ultrasound in under 90 seconds, her movements economical and her voice steady as granite. She positions the probe, and there it is, the fluttering brightness of a dissecting aorta, the wall of the vessel separating like a window opening. The aneurysm is contained, for now. For maybe another 6 hours, maybe less. She's seen this before. She's watched people die from this before. She finds Ashford outside the break room, where he's pouring coffee with the casual precision of someone who has never once questioned whether his decisions were correct. Bed 7, she says. Aortic dissection. Type B. He needs imaging, cardiothoracic consult, and anticoagulation protocol initiated immediately. She delivers it as information, not opinion. She delivers it as fact. Ashford turns, and his expression shifts through several stages in rapid sequence, surprise, irritation, and then something harder. Something that looks like calculation. That's premature, he says, and his voice is smooth as oil. The EKG doesn't show anything significant. The patient is likely experiencing anxiety-related chest pain, which is far more common in this demographic. He takes a slow sip of coffee. I appreciate your initiative, Miss Hayes, but let's not order every imaging modality available simply because we're feeling cautious today. Natalie meets his eyes with the kind of sustained contact that makes most people flinch. She doesn't blink. She breathes once, measured and controlled. The ultrasound is already complete. The dissection is visible. Type B, contained distal to the left subclavian artery. He's going to arrest without intervention. She delivers each sentence like a single strike. This isn't intuition, doctor. This is imaging. For a moment, Ashford's coffee cup stops halfway to his lips. The break room is quiet enough that you can hear the refrigerator humming, the distant rhythm of the monitors in the trauma bay, the sound of wheels on tile as someone pushes a stretcher past the door. He sets the cup down very carefully on the counter. I'll review your findings, he says, and his voice has gone cold in a way that suggests he's already planning something. But I would suggest, Miss Hayes, that you familiarize yourself with the proper channels for communicating diagnostic concerns. Going directly to conclusions, especially ones that bypass the attending physician, isn't how we operate here. She understands in that moment, with the clarity of someone who has briefed generals, that she's made a mistake. Not the diagnostic mistake. The professional mistake. She's bypassed him. She's made him look at his own error through someone else's eyes, and there are only two kinds of men in positions of power, the kind who can admit when they're wrong, and the kind who destroy the people who prove them wrong. Ashford, with his silver hair and his board connections and his 9 years building a perfect hierarchy, is clearly the second kind. Over the next 4 hours, Ashford orders the imaging. He calls cardiothoracic. He initiates the anticoagulation protocol. And by the time the patient is being prepped for emergency repair, everyone in the department understands exactly whose clinical judgment saved the man's life, and it wasn't the department chief. Ashford knows this too. He's standing outside bed 7, watching through the glass partition as Natalie checks the patients for one more time before transport, confirming the site is patent, her hands moving with the kind of muscle memory that has nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with something else, something before San Diego, something she came here to leave behind. He's watching her scarred left hand move with that invisible tremor, and he's making phone calls in his mind, already constructing the narrative. If she can bypass him on a diagnosis, she's a threat to protocol. If she's a threat to protocol, she's a liability. If she's a liability, he has options. The overhead intercom crackles, trauma incoming, ETA 3 minutes. 28-year-old male, training accident, significant hemorrhage, Army Ranger Regiment. The words hang in the air like a forecast. Ashford steps away from the window. Natalie's jaw tightens exactly 1 millimeter, the only visible reaction she allows herself, and she's already moving, already asking what they'll need, already preparing Trauma Bay 1 with the efficiency of someone who has done this before, in places where the training accidents came with automatic weapons fire as a soundtrack. Ashford approaches the nurse's station, where she's pulling out a 14-gauge angiocath needle for rapid infusion setup. His voice is low, conversational, designed not to carry across the room. "I want to commend your quick thinking on the earlier patient," he says. "Truly. But we do need to discuss chain of command at some point this week. These situations, they're learning opportunities. For everyone." The way he smiles suggests he's already learned exactly what he needs to know, that Natalie Hayes has skills that don't match her resume, and skills that don't match her resume are problems that need investigating. She nods once, doesn't look up from the supplies. "Yes, doctor." Her voice is pitched low, deferential in a way that wouldn't fool anyone who was actually paying attention. But Ashford isn't actually paying attention. He's too busy thinking about how to phrase this, how to protect his reputation, how to make sure everyone understands that even though the outcome was good, the method was inappropriate, and the nurse who executed it without his approval is the real problem. He doesn't see her checking the wall clock, calculating blood loss rates in her head. He doesn't see the invisible shift that happens in her shoulders, the way the deferential posture is a choice, and choices can change. The automatic doors of the emergency bay burst open, and the world narrows to the sound of boot heels and urgent voices and the high whine of the trauma siren. What's coming through those doors will change everything, but Natalie doesn't know that yet. She only knows that she's been given one chance to live anonymously in a city that doesn't know her name, one chance to rebuild something normal, and that chance is about to be tested by someone who will walk through those doors carrying a secret in his blood, a secret that will recognize what she is, even if her face tells him nothing. The room went silent when Ashford walked in. Natalie was adjusting the foredrip on the aortic dissection patient, the one she'd caught, the one she'd saved, when his shadow fell across the monitor. His voice came soft and deliberate, calculated to carry. Nurse Hayes decided to practice medicine today. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to the family. The daughter's eyes widened. The son's jaw clenched. She ordered a CT angiogram without consulting me. Inappropriate scope of practice for someone with her level of training. Natalie's hand stilled on the medication cart. Her jaw tightened, just barely, just enough that anyone trained to read faces would see the tremor she refused to let reach her voice. She didn't look at him. She didn't defend herself. She adjusted the drip rate by 0.3 milliliters and said nothing. Ashford wasn't finished. He never was. We'll discuss your freelancing later, Florence. The nickname hit like he intended it to hit, diminishing, a weapon dressed as familiarity. Florence. Not Natalie. Not Major. Florence. Like she was someone small enough to fit inside a sound. She took one measured breath. Her hand stayed steady. The daughter was looking between Natalie and Ashford now, uncertainty blooming in her expression, the kind of doubt that only authority can plant. Ashford smiled, the satisfied expression of a man who'd just rewired someone's trust in front of witnesses. He turned to leave, his credential badge catching the fluorescent light like a flare. Natalie watched his reflection disappear through the doorway. The break room existed in the particular quiet of a place where people took breaks to escape. 2 hours later, she pushed through the heavy door and stopped. 6 of them sat at the lunch table: Dr. Chen, Sarah from the night shift, Miguel from triage, Janet from trauma, and 2 respiratory therapists whose names she knew but whose loyalty apparently had limits. They didn't look up immediately. They had the practiced casualness of people pretending not to notice something already decided. Dr. Chen saw her first. He stood, gathered his lunch container without a word, without even a glance in her direction. Just stood and left. Then Sarah. Then Miguel. One by one they rose like dominoes falling in reverse, collecting their things, their voices dropping to nothing. The silence wasn't passive. It was active. It was a choice made visible. The last one to leave was Janet, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable about it, her shoulders hunched as she passed. Natalie sat alone at the empty table, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like an insect trapped in the fixture. The buzz was the only sound. She didn't cry. She didn't clench her fists. She opened her packed lunch, a turkey sandwich, apple, water bottle, and ate methodically, each bite measured and deliberate, as if by maintaining physical discipline she could contain the thing moving beneath her ribs. Pain was information. She'd learned that in Ramadi, learned it when shrapnel taught her what nerve damage felt like, learned it when an IED took Marcus and 2 of their surgical techs and left her hearing fragmented in one ear. This was different pain. This was social pain, institutional pain, the kind that moved through a system like infection through a wound. She finished her lunch and went back to the floor. Friday came with the kind of clarity that only humiliation can bring. The unit board sat near the elevators where everyone passed, the location was deliberate, the visibility deliberate, the timing deliberate. A formal write-up. Her name in capital letters. Hayes, N. Policy violations. 3 items listed, each one a situation where her judgment had made the difference between a patient living and a patient dying. Item 1, ordered imaging without physician approval. Underlying it, invisible to most people but perfectly clear to her, was the truth: saved a patient's life by catching what the attending physician had missed. Item 2, administered emergency medication before MD arrival. Translation, prevented a stroke by acting when no doctor was in the room and the patient was crashing. Item 3, performed advanced assessment beyond nursing scope. Translation, identified an aortic dissection that should have killed a man, except she had hand steady enough and knowledge deep enough to catch what Ashford's training had failed to see. She stood in front of the board, looking at her own name like it belonged to someone else. Her reflection was visible in the glass covering the write-up. Blonde hair pulled back tight. Eyes that had seen worse than this. Scrubs that fit like skin she'd learned to wear. She looked like what she was pretending to be, a nurse. Not a major. Not someone who'd held a surgical unit together for 11 hours under sustained fire. Not someone who'd lost a husband to the same mission that had broken her. Just Florence. Just a person who'd stepped out of line. Ashford's footsteps came before Ashford did. She heard them on the tile first, the particular confidence of someone who owned a space. He slowed when he saw her standing there. She turned to him. Held his gaze. And then it happened, something her body did that her mind had forbidden, a single tear that escaped before she could contain it, tracking down her cheek with the precision of a tactical decision. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let him see it. Let him think he'd won. I've been destroyed by better men than you, Doctor. Her voice was granite steady, the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived catastrophe. Far better. More competent. With more authority. More reason to hate me. She lifted her hand slowly and wiped her cheek without looking away from his eyes. The tear was gone. The vulnerability was gone. What remained was something that made him take an actual step backward, because what he saw in her face wasn't defeat. It was the look of someone who was about to prove something he couldn't afford to understand. Ashford recovered quickly. He smiled. The smile was meant to be victorious. Pack your things by Monday, Florence. I've already made the calls. His voice had that satisfied thickness of someone who'd just pushed a button and expected an explosion. She didn't respond. She turned back to the board, looking at the write-up with the kind of attention a surgeon gives to a diagnosis that confirms the worst. 3 situations where she'd been right. 3 times where her judgment had saved a life. 3 times that Ashford had documented her competence and weaponized it against her. The irony moved through her like a drug. The call came at 0300 hours. Natalie was in the on-call room, not quite asleep, existing in that particular state of exhaustion where rest becomes irrelevant and the body just waits. The overhead system crackled, and dispatch's voice was all contained urgency, trauma activation. Army Ranger, training accident, ETA for minutes. She was moving before the message finished. The trauma bay doors were already opening when the ambulance screamed up, the red and blue lights painting the parking lot like a seizure. The stretcher wheeled through the bay and the paramedic's voice was rapid-fire and clinical, 28-year-old male, compound fracture left femur with tourniquet applied pre-hospital, significant chest trauma, sustained hemorrhage, BP 110 dropping to 70/40 and unstable. The ranger's fatigues were soaked through with blood so dark it looked black under the bay lights. Pressure dressings covered his chest, and his dog tags caught the light as they transferred him to the trauma bed. Morrison, K. His face was covered in road rash and gauze, unrecognizable, just another casualty wearing army colors. Ashford was already barking orders, his hands moving through the motions like someone playing a role he'd practiced but never truly inhabited. Type and cross, get me O negative, we need 2 large bore 4s, get me CBC, CMP, lactate. The lab tech was running numbers. Doctor, we've got a problem. His type AB negative. We're out of stock. Closest supply is at Naval Medical Center, 40 minutes minimum. Ashford swore, actually swore, because there were no good options and everyone in the bay knew it. For minutes until cardiac arrest at this rate. Maybe less. The ranger's pressure was dropping like a stone in still water. 75. 70. 68. Natalie stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, the way it had learned to be in a place where quiet could carry more weight than shouting. I may be negative. Ashford didn't even look at her. Of course you are. Always the hero, Florence. Get her to phlebotomy. The sneer in his voice was predictable and worthless. She was already rolling up her sleeve, already walking toward the nurse running the direct donation setup, already becoming a source of blood for a man she'd never seen before. The tourniquet went on her arm, the needle slid in, 14 gauge, smooth puncture, and the machine began pulling her hole into plastic tubing. 1 unit. Then another. Her blood moving toward a body that was failing in real time. The ranger's pressure was climbing, 75. 80. 85. Stable. For 8 minutes it was stable, and Natalie watched a piece of herself flowing into a stranger's veins, keeping him alive through the mechanism of simple biology and the accident of matching blood types. Then the monitor screamed. The resident's voice cracked, his crashing, pressure dropping, check the chest tube. Blood poured from the tube, not the steady ooze of controlled bleeding but the rushing flood of something massive and internal. The ranger's chest was filling with blood from somewhere they hadn't found, from somewhere between the imaging and the bay. Ashford moved like he'd forgotten how to think, barking orders that circled back on themselves, his hands hovering uselessly above the patient like he was afraid to actually touch anything. Natalie saw what he didn't see. The subtle bulge in the left anterior chest wall. The specific pattern of bleeding that only came from one place. Cardiac laceration. Not a chest wall bleed. Not a simple pneumothorax. The heart itself was bleeding. She'd seen this once before. Ramadi, 2009. An IED blast had caught a convoy, and one of the Marines had come in with that exact presentation, that exact desperate pattern of vital collapse. She'd been the surgical technician then, before she wore officer rank, before she wore anything but the understanding that some injuries demanded immediate action. Ashford was still giving useless orders. Get a second line, push fluids, where's the next unit? The Ranger's O2 sat was dropping. 88. 81. 75. The machine screaming their particular song of failure. Natalie felt something shift in her body, not fear. Something older. Something that had survived Ramadi and 2 Purple Hearts and a deployment that had taken the 2 most important people in her life. Her hands moved. The trauma bay doors burst open at 0300 hours and the room changed in the way that only critical hemorrhage could change a room, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch that transformed organized medicine into controlled chaos. The stretcher wheeled through with the sound of urgency, a young male with a tourniquet cinched tight above his left knee, pressure dressings already darkening through with blood that would not stop, and beside him a combat medic in advanced combat lifesaver gear calling out vitals like a man who had done this in a field hospital under fire. BP 88/62, dropping. Type and cross already flagged, we need O negative or universal. The patient's eyes were the color of storm clouds, conscious but moving toward shock, breathing in short quick gasps that meant his body was already shutting down the periphery to save the core. Natalie was at the monitor station pulling up his labs before anyone else had registered which bed he was headed for, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the kind of muscle memory that didn't require thought. The screen populated with a single line that stopped her breathing for exactly 1 second, AB negative. The rarest blood type in the hospital, represented by exactly 1 viable donor in the entire facility at 0300 on a Wednesday morning, and that donor was standing in Trauma Bay 2 wearing a stethoscope around her neck and 7 years of trying very hard not to remember she had ever known how to save anyone at all. The attending resident looked up from the patient's chest, scanning the faces in the bay. We need AB negative. Type and screen takes 20 minutes minimum, and this patient doesn't have 20 minutes. Who has AB negative in this hospital? Natalie's hand had already moved before she fully thought it through, raising just slightly, a gesture so small it might have been invisible. Dr. Ashford, standing at the far corner of the bay checking his phone, glanced up with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something that would complicate his evening. The attending resident's eyes widened. You're AB negative. Natalie nodded once. I can have you prepped and donating in 4 minutes. She was already moving toward the blood bank, unbuttoning her scrub top. There was no hesitation, no pause, no calculation of risk or benefit or what this blood drawn from her own veins might cost her later. This was a stranger, a man whose face she would never remember, whose name she did not know, but his blood type matched hers and he was dying, and in Ramadi she had learned that the calculation between those 2 things was not complicated at all. The combat medic standing beside the stretcher watched her move and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that passed too quickly to name. The blood bank technician had her in a chair 15 minutes later with a needle in her left antecubital fossa, watching the bag fill with her own dark red cells at a rate that looked somehow too fast. Feeling dizzy, the tech asked. Natalie shook her head. Her right hand sat steady on the armrest. Her left was being asked to do the difficult thing, which meant she had learned to keep her right available for whatever came next. The bag swelled from pale pink to deep crimson to the color of old rust, exactly 450 milliliters of her own survival being transferred into a plastic pouch that would spend the next 12 hours in someone else's veins instead of hers. When it was finished, the technician taped a bandage over the needle site with the kind of efficient care that suggested she did this 50 times a month and never once wondered about the people whose blood she was processing. You should rest for a few minutes. Get some fluids. Natalie was already standing, the slight head rush that came from giving blood hitting her system like a distant memory of something she had learned to ignore. The ranger was on his second unit of her blood when his monitor started singing a song it should not have been singing at all. The rhythm that had been steady, a reassuring beep 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 that meant his heart was beating, his system was compensating, his body was still fighting, suddenly compressed into something faster and wrong, a flutter that the attending resident recognized about half a second before the patient's eyes rolled back and his body went rigid. "He's crashing," someone called out. The oxygen saturation numbers started dropping like a stone through dark water. 98%. 92%. 85%. The attending resident's hand went to the defibrillator pads already on the patient's chest, ready to shock him back into rhythm, but the real problem wasn't a rhythm problem at all. The ranger's chest was filling with blood from somewhere inside, somewhere the initial assessment had missed, and all the electrical therapy in the world would not fix the fact that a man could not survive bleeding to death from within. Natalie saw it the way she had learned to see it in a trauma tent in Ramadi, where you had maybe 90 seconds to make a diagnosis before the decision was made for you, the way his neck veins were distending despite aggressive chest compressions, the way his pupils were fixed and dilated, the pattern of blood pooling under his skin, the clinical presentation of someone whose heart was still beating but whose chest cavity was filling with hemorrhage faster than any foot could replace it. "Cardiac laceration," she said quietly. The attending resident's head turned. "Undetected. He needs a thoracotomy now or he's dead in 3 minutes." Not a question. Not a request. The kind of statement that comes from someone who has watched people die from this exact injury, who knows what the next 3 minutes will look like if nobody moves, who understands that the only variable that matters now is speed. Dr. Ashford's voice rose from the corner of the bay like something trying to reassert control over a situation that was spiraling into territory he did not manage. "We need to wait for the surgeon. We cannot simply." The ranger's blood pressure was dropping like someone was draining it out through a hole in his chest, which of course they were. 70/50. 65/45. The monitor rhythm was becoming irregular, the heart working harder and harder to pump through a chest filling with hemorrhage. 0300 hours in San Diego was 0300 hours everywhere, no surgeon on the floor, no thoracic team standing by, just the people in this room and 90 seconds, maybe less. Natalie moved without waiting for clarification or approval or anyone's permission to be the person she was about to become. Her hand found the scalpel from the crash cart, the same movement she had made 17 times in a field hospital that did not have real scalpels, that had used whatever was sharp and sterile and capable of cutting through skin and muscle to find the hemorrhage underneath. "Step back," she said to Ashford, not a request but an order in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere deeper than her throat, somewhere that had lived through things that had given her the right to make it. Ashford's face had gone the color of antiseptic. "Nurse Hayes, I am ordering you to," but she was already moving, already making the incision between the 4th and 5th ribs, and the sound of it was a small wet whisper as the blade found the intercostal space, opened it like a mouth trying to scream. Her left hand was shaking slightly as she reached for the retractor, trembling with the muscle memory of doing this under mortar fire, under the weight of decision, under the knowledge that the next 30 seconds would either save a life or end one. But her right hand was steady as a surgeon's laser when it moved into that open chest cavity and found the lacerated right ventricle, blood pooling in the pericardial sac like rain in a cupped palm. She clamped the bleeding vessel with the kind of precision that made the resident whisper, "Jesus Christ, where did she learn that?" under his breath. Natalie's fingers worked the suture through the tissue, closing the wound with the small neat stitches of someone who had closed wounds in darkness by flashlight and touch alone. The monitor rhythm stabilized as she worked. BP climbing. The bleeding stopped. The ranger gasped, his first full breath in 90 seconds, his oxygen saturation crawling back up, 72%. 78%. 84%. Sinus rhythm. His heart finally beating without working against a chest full of blood. She stepped back and let her hands shake now that they could afford to shake. Let the tremor move through her fingers like electricity now that the crisis was over and the ranger was breathing and the monitor was singing its steady reassuring song once more. Her scrubs were speckled with his blood, and her heart rate was elevated, and she could feel the slight dizziness from having given too much of her own cells an hour ago, and none of that mattered because a man was alive who should have been dead in the next 3 minutes. She was pulling off her gloves when she noticed Ashford moving toward the corner of the bay, pulling out his phone with the expression of a man who had just watched his authority be obliterated in front of every nurse and resident and attending physician in the room, and was about to do something about it. The first call was to the nursing director. Hayes just performed surgery without authorization. I want her credentials pulled and an investigation opened immediately. The second call was to his contact on the hospital board, his voice low and rapid. We have a critical liability issue that needs immediate action. A nurse just performed a surgical procedure in my trauma bay. We need legal now. The third call was to credentialing. Practicing medicine without a license. Full investigation, full documentation, I'm the reporting physician. By the time Natalie had finished closing the chest with the kind of precision that came from knowing exactly how to do this part, security was waiting at the trauma bay entrance with the kind of formal expressions that meant this was going to become something official. Natalie Hayes, the security officer said, and his voice was not unkind. You're on administrative leave effective immediately, pending investigation of practicing medicine without a license. She removed her gloves without protest, her eyes on the ranger's still face, on the monitor reading his stable vital signs, on the proof that whatever else happened now, he was going to live. She had no words that could explain what she had just done, because explaining required telling people things that could not be explained at 0300 hours by someone who was supposed to be just a nurse in an emergency department, supposed to stay inside the lines, supposed to not remember things from before San Diego. She had come here to disappear into the smooth anonymous life of civilian medicine, to be small and quiet and forgettable, and the moment she had seen AB negative on that lab screen, the moment the ranger's chest had started filling with blood, she had become the thing she had promised herself she would never be again. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she would do the exact same thing in the next 90 seconds if it happened again, and they both knew it. Her hands moved before thought could catch up. Scalpel from the crash cart. One motion. The blade bit through skin and muscle with the precision of muscle memory that hadn't fired in 3 years but never truly forgot. The incision opened clean, left anterior thoracotomy, fourth intercostal space. Blood spilled across her forearms, warm and copper bright. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Just reached into the cavity like she was reaching into an open wound in Ramadi and found what was killing him, cardiac laceration, left ventricle, bleeding into the pericardium like a broken faucet. Her fingers worked with the terrifying fluid precision of hands that had held 47 lives together while mortars screamed overhead. Clamp. Retract. The bleeding stopped. The monitor climbed. 87. 92. 96. Sinus rhythm returned like a voice answering after years of silence. Dr. Ashford stood frozen in the corner, his face the color of clinical death. He watched her close the chest with running sutures, each not precise and perfect, the work of someone who had done this under fire while rounds punched through plywood and screams echoed off concrete. Her movements carried authority that had nothing to do with hospital credentials. This was the kind of competence that came from having already seen the worst and rebuilt something functional from the ruins. The room was silent except for the ventilator's wheeze and the soft hiss of the chest tube draining. She tied the final knot. Step back. Checked Morrison's vitals one more time. 120/85. Heart rate 108. O2 sat 98%. Stable. Her scrubs were painted in his blood, streaks of crimson against the blue fabric like a battlefield report written in vital fluid. She pulled off her gloves and met Ashford's eyes across the stretcher. He was still frozen. She watched the moment he understood that whatever she was, it wasn't something he could destroy through the normal channels of hospital politics and weaponized policy violations. Dr. Ashford's hand moved to his phone before she finished turning away. 3 calls. She didn't hear them, but she felt them the way you feel a targeting laser before you hear the shot. The nursing director answered on the second ring. His voice carried the cold precision of a man executing a contingency plan he'd already prepared. She didn't need to hear the words. She'd lived this conversation in advance, the practiced concern, the documented violations, the clinical observations carefully positioned to sound like objective fact rather than calculated destruction. The second call went to his contact on the hospital board, a man Natalie had never met but whose influence had roots that went down deep into the institutional bedrock of Oak Creek Memorial. Ashford's tone shifted for this call, became deferential, the voice of a man calling in a favor from someone who owed him nothing but felt obligated by decades of medical school connections and country club proximity. The third call reached credentialing. By the time Natalie was documenting Morrison's post-procedure status in the EMR, her administrative access was being suspended. By the time she stepped out of Trauma Bay 4 and walked to the break room to wash Morrison's blood from her hands and arms, there was an email waiting in her personal account with a time stamp of 23 minutes prior. Suspension of privileges. Pending investigation. Practicing medicine without a license. Administrative leave, effective immediately. The language was clinical and careful, the work of someone who understood that precise language was more damaging than rage because it sounded inevitable, professional, the only reasonable response to such clear violation of scope of practice. She read the email standing in front of the sink, soap running warm over hands that had just moved with the precision of a trauma surgeon. Her reflection in the mirror above the basin looked like a ghost wearing scrubs. One breath. Just one. Then she deleted the email, clocked out, and walked toward her car without speaking to anyone. The rain started before she left the parking lot, heavy and cold, the kind of San Diego rain that felt like punishment for the sun that had abandoned the city. The veteran cemetery sat on a hillside in Point Loma, rows of white marble stretching toward the Pacific like stone teeth. She drove through the gates at 2 in the morning, her car the only one moving through the flooded streets. The markers glowed pale in the headlights, thousands of them, each one a life that had been measured in years but defined by a single moment of consequence. She knew where Marcus was without looking it up. Captain Marcus James Hayes, 1988 to 2019. Killed in action, Ramadi, Iraq. The date sat under his name like a summary of everything that mattered reduced to the space between 2 years. She knelt in the mud, her blood-speckled scrubs soaking through at the knees. The rain hammered down like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. Her hands, which had just saved a man's life with instruments meant only for diagnosis, now gripped the wet grass above her husband's coffin. 3 years. It had been 3 years since they buried him in this ground, and she had spent every day since trying to be someone he would recognize if he could see her now. Someone quiet. Someone normal. Someone who didn't remember how to hold a beating heart in her hands and keep it working. I tried, she whispered, and her voice cracked like old leather under pressure. I tried to leave it behind like you wanted. You said I could be normal, that I could heal, that we could start over in San Diego and I could just be a nurse. Just help people the civilian way, the way that didn't require. She couldn't finish. The rain filled her mouth. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing blood across her cheek. I failed again. Marcus, I failed again. I always fail at being anything but this. Lightning split the sky above the cemetery, and for a moment every marker cast a shadow like a ghost standing vigil. She traced his name with her index finger, the carved letters rough under her touch. His name and his service number and the fact that he had been 29 years old when everything broke. When the IED took his left arm and her hearing in her left ear and her ability to ever feel safe in a moment of silence. When she carried him out of the compound while incoming fire chewed through the concrete and her hands moved with the kind of desperate precision that comes from knowing you have exactly 90 seconds to stop the bleeding before physics makes it irrelevant. They're going to take everything, she told the stone. My license, my credentials, my reason for being here. Ashford's destroying it all and I can't even explain why because I can't tell them about you, about what we lost, about who I was before San Diego. Can't tell them that I'm Major Natalie Hayes, combat medic, 3rd Surgical Support Company, 321st Medical Detachment. That I've held more lives together than most people will ever see. That the reason I can operate with a scalpel from a crash cart is because I did it with field dressings and shaking hands and prayer. Can't tell them that quiet nurse who checks vitals is a lie I told so you could rest knowing I was safe. She pressed her forehead against the marble, and the cold of it felt like truth. The rain mixes with tears she had held since the moment Ashford dressed her down in the patient's room, since the break room staff gathered their things and left her sitting alone, since she read the list of 3 policy violations that had each saved a life. She had measured those tears out in single moments, in brief pauses where she let herself feel it before closing that door again and moving forward. But here, at Marcus's grave, in the rain at 2 in the morning with blood still drying under her fingernails, the dam broke. Not a collapse. Not a breakdown. Just an honest accounting of what remained when you took away everything she'd built. "I saved him," she said. The words came out rough, barely shaped. "The ranger, the one I gave blood to. The one Ashford was already killing with his misdiagnosis. I saved him the way I couldn't save you. And it's going to cost me everything because I couldn't stop moving. I couldn't stop my hands from remembering what they know how to do. And now I'm going to lose my license and probably lose the apartment and definitely lose any chance at the normal life you wanted for me, and I can't even be angry about it because he was bleeding to death and my hands just moved and I fixed it, and if I had to choose between keeping my nursing credentials and keeping him alive, I'd make the exact same choice again, and we both know it." She stayed there until the rain stopped and the sky began to lighten toward dawn, her knees pressed into mud over the body of the man she had married in a chapel on Fort Bragg and buried in San Diego rain. When she finally stood, her legs didn't want to work, but she moved anyway. She always moved. That was the whole problem. That was why she was still alive when Marcus wasn't. That was why she could operate on people with a crash cart scalpel and why she couldn't seem to be anything except what the army had built her to be, even when being that thing was going to destroy the civilian life she'd tried so hard to construct out of grief and compromise and the stubborn belief that she could outrun her own competence. The apartment was empty when she got home. She sat on the couch in her blood-stained scrubs and opened the closet in the bedroom. Behind the civilian clothes she'd bought to become someone else, in a cardboard box from a medical supply company, her service decoration sat waiting. A bronze star. A purple heart. Another purple heart. And underneath, in a small velvet case, the silver star with its 5-point center and the weight of 47 lives it represented. She picked up the silver star and held it in her palm, and it was heavier than she remembered. Everything was heavier. The rain. The silence. The knowledge that in approximately 36 hours, she would be officially terminated from Oak Creek Memorial pending investigation, and Dr. Ashford would be going on live television to discuss dangerous overreach by undertrained staff, and no one would ever know why she'd done what she did in that trauma bay. Some truths just stayed buried in the ground next to the people you couldn't save. She closed the box without opening the velvet case all the way. Some things stayed hidden. She opened her laptop and drafted a resignation letter. 2 sentences. "I am withdrawing from the nursing program effective immediately. I have decided to pursue other opportunities." She read it twice, then sent it to the hospital's Human Resources Department at 3 in the morning, preempting the termination hearing scheduled for Wednesday. Let Ashford have his investigation. Let the board have their meeting. She wouldn't be there to defend herself. Major Natalie Hayes didn't defend herself. She just moved forward and let the consequences fall where they would. In Trauma Bay 4, Morrison slept while military officers took positions outside his door like guardians of a secret that had just been discovered. His heart beat steadily, held together by the hand of a woman who had disappeared into San Diego specifically to never be found. 12 hours away, Dr. Ashford met with a local news producer and rehearsed the talking points about dangerous overreach and hospital accountability, rehearsed his smile and his measured concern, rehearsed the performance that would air on Tuesday at 5 o'clock and be the beginning of the ending of his career, though he had no way of knowing it yet. The rain kept falling across the city, and Natalie Hayes sat in the dark with her blood-stained scrubs and her buried decorations and the knowledge that she had just used a crash cart scalpel to save a man's life, and in doing so, had finally given Dr. Ashford the exact ammunition he needed to move from careful political maneuvering into active sabotage, which meant the real confrontation was coming, and she would have to face it unprepared because she'd spent so long trying to be someone she wasn't, that she'd forgotten how to be who she actually was. The studio smelled like coffee and the kind of desperation that comes from believing your own narrative. Dr. Ashford sat in the anchor chair, makeup applied, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile the smile of a man who had already won. The makeup artist brushed powder across his forehead one last time. 2 minutes until live. He checked his reflection, adjusted the MIC clip to his chest, and felt the weight of institutional power settle around his shoulders like a favorite coat. The hospital board had his back. The credentialing committee would follow his recommendation. Major Hayes would be gone by Friday, her license under investigation, her reputation in ashes. This interview was simply the public narrative, the voice of safety, of protocol, of a physician protecting patients from dangerous overreach. The anchor, Jennifer Chen, reviewed her notes. Ashford had crafted this perfectly. A sympathetic email to the news director. A leaked memo about dangerous scope of practice violations. A narrative so clean, so compelling, that no one would ask questions. The camera lights brightened. 3, 2, 1. Good evening. I'm Jennifer Chen. Tonight we're discussing a troubling trend in American hospitals, nurses crossing into territory that should belong exclusively to trained physicians. My guest is Dr. Marcus Ashford, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Oak Creek Memorial right here in San Diego. Dr. Ashford, just last week your hospital experienced exactly this kind of dangerous overreach, didn't it? Ashford leaned forward, his expression grave and concerned. Jennifer, what happened was deeply troubling. A nurse, without proper authorization, without physician oversight, performed surgical procedures on a patient. Major trauma surgery. This isn't about restricting nursing, it's about protecting patients. Nurses save lives. But they do it by working within their scope of practice. When they step outside that. Jennifer raised her finger to her earpiece. Her expression shifted. Something flickered across her face. Confusion. Then alarm. Doctor, I'm being told we have an urgent call coming in. We need to take it live. I apologize for the interruption. She turned to camera. Ladies and gentlemen, we're connecting to a caller with urgent information regarding this case. Caller, you're live with Dr. Ashford. The screen split. A 4-star general appeared. Army dress uniform, 3 rows of ribbons across his chest, his rank insignia sharp as steel. His name tape read Morrison. His face carried the kind of weathered calm that comes from commanding thousands. He didn't wait for a greeting. I'm calling about the nurse you're describing, Dr. Ashford. Major Natalie Hayes. Silver Star recipient. She saved that patient's life using surgical techniques she earned under fire in Ramadi, treating combat casualties in conditions you've never experienced and, frankly, never will. The general's voice moved like a tank idling in a garage, heavy, methodical, unstoppable. I also pulled your file, Doctor. You were dismissed from Walter Reed Military Hospital in 2015. You were dismissed for falsifying credentials. You claimed surgical experience you did not possess. 2 patients died because of procedures you were not qualified to perform. Ashford's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No sound came out. The general continued, his tone never rising, never wavering. Major Hayes has more emergency trauma experience in combat situations than you have accumulated in your entire 30-year career. She saved more lives in a single day than you have in a decade. And you attempted to destroy her for it. Jennifer's face had gone white. Her hand trembled as she brought it to her throat. Furthermore, the general said, I've contacted the State Medical Board, the Hospital Accreditation Committee, and the Joint Commission. Your credentials will be reviewed within 72 hours. And doctor? That patient you're discussing? The one you claim was endangered? He's standing right here. He asked me to call. He asked me to thank Major Hayes. He also asked me to tell you that your career just ended. The feed cut. Not a transition. A cut. Dead air for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Jennifer stared at the empty space where the general had been. The studio lights hummed. A camera operator's phone buzzed. Someone in the control room made a sound like a wounded animal. Ashford stood up. His chair fell backward. He reached for the microphone as if to say something, but Jennifer pulled it away. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I think we're going to cut to commercial." But the feed had already gone live. Within 40 minutes, someone had clipped it. Within 2 hours, the clip had 2 million views. By Wednesday morning, 8 million. The #HashReaperMajor trended number 3 in North America. Comments flooded in, "She saved his life and he tried to destroy hers. This is what a real hero looks like." Ashford lied about military hospital dismissal. "My sister's a nurse there, she remembers this." Someone posted Ashford's address. Someone else posted his wife's Instagram. The hospital's phone lines exploded with calls, not from grateful patients but from outraged citizens, from veterans, from medical professionals who suddenly understood that they'd been listening to a liar the entire time. At 0800 Wednesday morning, the hospital board arrived at Oak Creek Memorial. The CEO walked directly to Ashford's office. The conversation lasted for minutes. By 0812, security was escorting him from the building. Cameras rolled in the parking lot. A local news team caught footage of him, his face the color of old bone, his hand shaking as he loaded boxes into his car. The nursing director who had signed the write-up against Natalie received a call from the board's legal team. She resigned by Thursday. The credentialing officer who had recommended investigation was transferred. Within 72 hours, the state medical board issued a formal notice. Dr. Marcus Ashford's medical license was under immediate investigation for credential falsification, patient endangerment, and fraud. By Friday, his license was suspended pending full review. His hospital privileges were terminated. His malpractice insurance was voided retroactively. His wife left on Saturday. The divorce papers arrived Monday morning. By the following Tuesday, a shaky phone video surfaced on Reddit, posted anonymously but instantly recognizable. It showed Dr. Ashford sitting at a folding table outside a strip mall, rain beginning to fall, a hand-painted banner behind him reading "Supplemental Insurance, Low Rates Guaranteed." His tie was loose. His eyes had the hollow quality of a man who had finally understood that the world didn't care about his excuses. He sat alone. Nobody stopped. Nobody even slowed down. A veteran in a wheelchair rolled past, caught sight of him, and deliberately spit on the pavement beside Ashford's table. The video went viral. Someone commented, "That's what happens when you come for a hero." It received 47,000 likes. 6 months after the interview, the rain that had been falling on Ashford's folding table had fallen across San Diego 1,000 times, and the city had changed. A new clinic opened on India Street, just north of downtown. The sign was simple, professional, the letters painted in military green, "Hayes Veterans Urgent Care." Below it, in smaller text, "Major N. Hayes, USA, Ret. Director." Inside, everything was different. The walls were pale blue, not institutional white. The waiting area had comfortable chairs, the kind you might sit in at home. On one wall hung a photograph, "Soldiers in Ramadi, 2009, a medical tent with sandbags and dust and determination." On another wall hung a shadow box. Inside, a silver star, 2 bronze stars, 2 purple hearts. Beside them, a faded unit patch, the Army Ranger scroll design, worn soft with age and handling. Natalie wore scrubs again. These had her name embroidered across the left chest, with her rank, Major N. Hayes, USA, Ret. Her left ear had a barely visible hearing aid. The tremor in her left hand remained, but she didn't hide it anymore. She moved through the clinic with the kind of focused grace that came from knowing exactly who she was and why she was there. The Ranger, Private First Class David Morrison, visited monthly, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to volunteer. He'd recovered completely from the cardiac laceration. The scar on his chest had faded to white, a thin line that looked like a question mark written in pale ink. He showed her something the first time he came back, the inside lining of his jacket, where he'd sewn an identical unit patch. "So I never forget," he said. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The patch was the conversation. Her staff included 3 veteran nurses and 2 former combat medics, one with her exact wound profile, IED blast, hearing loss, hand tremor, the physical map of remedy written in scar tissue. The waiting room filled every afternoon with soldiers who needed someone who understood what it meant to bleed and keep going. A Marine with a panic attack. An Army sergeant with a traumatic brain injury. A Navy corpsman with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much to ever fully unsee it. Natalie moved between them like someone fluent in a language the rest of the world was still trying to learn. At Marcus's grave, she stood in sunlight now instead of rain. The ground was dry, the stone warm beneath her palm. "I'm not running anymore," she told the headstone. "I'm doing what we both did best. I'm saving lives. Just like you taught me. Just like we promised." Her phone buzzed. An emergency incoming, a young Marine with a panic attack, unable to breathe, convinced he was dying. She didn't call an ambulance. She headed back to the clinic. 6 minutes later, he was sitting in the quiet room with a cup of coffee and Natalie explaining breathing techniques in a voice that carried absolute authority because it was backed by absolute understanding. By the time he left, his hands had stopped shaking. Across the city, in a strip mall parking lot that seemed to accumulate more rain than anywhere else in San Diego, Dr. Ashford sat at his folding table watching people walk past without looking at him. The supplemental insurance business had generated exactly 3 customers. One had claimed the policy was fraudulent. The insurance company had reviewed his credentials again and found additional falsifications from his early career. His medical license review had ended with permanent revocation. His career wasn't suspended. It was dead. A veteran in a motorized wheelchair rolled through the parking lot. He recognized Ashford from the viral video. He didn't say anything. He simply turned his chair slightly and deliberately spit on the ground beside the folding table, then rolled on without looking back. Ashford packed up his materials as the rain intensified. In 30 seconds, everything was loaded into his car. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, staring at nothing. The folding table lay across the back seat like a promise that had never been kept. Inside Hayes Veterans Urgent Care, Natalie sutures a young soldier's hand while he tells her about Kandahar, about the moment an IED destroyed his convoy, about the medic who held his hand while they waited for evacuation. She understands every word. Not just medically, but spiritually. She's lived in that space between life and death, held the line, watched the clock tick, made decisions under fire. When he finishes, she ties off the final suture and meets his eyes. "You're going to be fine," she says. It's not a prediction. It's a command, and they both know it. He nods. He believes her because she's already proven she can save lives when it matters most. The camera pulls back, rising slowly, the clinic floor falling away beneath the lens, rising until it frames the shadow box on her office wall. The silver star catches the light. The bronze stars gleam. The purple hearts hold the glow of recognition that took 6 months of televised destruction to earn. The faded unit patch sits beside them, the Army Ranger scroll worn soft as prayer, a reminder that some people never stop serving, some people never stop saving, and some people walk among us every single day in scrubs or in wheelchairs or in the quiet moments after midnight, carrying the weight of things the world will never fully understand. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling us about someone in your life who's a hero nobody knows about. Because the greatest acts of courage often happen where cameras never go. Thank you for watching.